We have 6 sessions designed to improve your writing and editing skills, which are super important for graduate studies. We're welcoming back Dr. Sauber, who's a professor of communication in the College of Arts and Sciences. He's also founding director of Drexel Edits, which provides pro bono editing and writing services for nonprofits throughout and surrounding the Drexel community. This is his 4th or 5th time doing this for us, so let's thank him and welcome him.
Thanks. Well, I'm delighted to be back here again. I'm always pleased to be among folks who really appreciate writing, or at least pretend to appreciate it. I know that this is an important issue for you as researchers and certainly as science students of science, because you have to pass through this hoop of correct and appropriate language in your writing. So I'm hoping to give you some ideas here that will help you out. I've taught a course in science writing here at Drexel for many years, and many of the students in that course are folks like you who are coming from the College of Engineering or the College of Arts and Sciences, College of Nursing and Health Professionals, trying to improve their writing so that they can pass through their programs. So in that course, I teach writing for research journals, but also writing for grant proposals, and also writing that adapts science, as you practice it, to a general reader, which is becoming, I think, more and more important to science and to the survival of science. So I'm delighted to be back. Let me just say what I want to cover today is a very particular aspect of writing that may seem quite basic to you, so I'm hoping I'm not offending anybody by going back this far in the teaching of writing. But verbs, it seems to me, have a particularly challenging nature to them, even for experienced writers like myself. If nothing else, whenever I'm writing the verb in a sentence, I have to look at it and say, okay, is this all right? I want to check it for correctness and appropriateness, because there are, as you probably know, so many variations in English especially on a basic verb, and I'll lay that out today. Also, verbs have particular requirements or style preferences in science. You probably have already heard about the prohibition against using the active voice in the methods section, and I want to sort of address that in particular. But in general, style guides in science focus quite a lot on verbs. So I thought it was an appropriate topic to open up this series with. The series will include other things like how to write concisely. You know, there are a few basic principles of writing that'll help you to say more with fewer words. I'll also do a workshop on coherence, which is the practice of putting words together so that they look like they should be read together. Words that will show transition between sentences as well as between paragraphs. And a few other topics that I hope you'll find useful. So, enough of that. Basically, what I want to convey to you today is 2 things. One is to be able to sort of recognize the various aspects of verbs, and to describe when particular verb forms are appropriate. So there's 2 things going on here. What's correct, what's grammatically correct, but also what is stylistically appropriate for a particular setting. And in this case, your setting is the writing of science in the research community. But also, even within the general research community, there are variations. As you probably know, there are a number of different style guides for research, right? In fact, it's not just a question of a style guide for biomedical engineering and a style guide for chemical engineering. I mean, there are those, but there are also style guides for the Journal of Chemical Engineering, right? It's a very specific niche guide for that journal. Now, most of them will adhere to the usual principles of good writing, but some of them will have their preferences. And it's up to you to find out what those preferences are before you submit your research paper. So ultimately, I'd like you to be able to select verbs that are correct and appropriate by the end of this seminar. So I'm going to use a lot of examples from actual research journal articles. One of my favorites that I use to illustrate good writing is this article. It's a research paper that surveyed graduate students about their sense of the palatability of tadpoles. Yes, they had to eat them. Things like this. You can imagine what the researcher did here. He probably had a bunch of graduate students that he wanted to survey. He says, "Look, you want to pass my course? Eat these tadpoles." So anyway, there's some good examples here of good writing that uses verbs correctly and appropriately. Let's see. So let's stop at this point and take a sort of pretest. See, where are you in your use of verbs right now? Didn't expect this, did you? Spelling counts. So this is a little handout for my workshop today. And inside on the second page, there is a little pretest. So you can get a sense of how are you using verbs right now. So take a couple of minutes to make your choices. And so, for instance, the very basic choice is, what's a verb? Now, that may seem pretty obvious, but maybe not. So take a moment to do these, and then we'll go over them. I have a pencil here. Oh, you got one? How are we doing? Do we need more time for this? Yes, no? Yeah, okay, another minute. By the way, I'd like to keep track of my presentations like this, so if you notice a particularly photogenic moment, could you take a picture of me in action and I'll put it up on my Facebook page. Thank you. So if you're still working on these, chances are good that you probably need this workshop, so let's move on. So the thing about verbs I was trying to convey to you was that they have so many variations on them. So let me give you a sense of what they are. First of all, there's a difference between a real verb and forms of verbs that aren't really verbs. They look like verbs, but they're not. They're called verbals, right? So we'll talk about them. Of course, there's the difference between singular and plural verbs, right? And this is a very basic writing concept. I don't think I have to spend too much time on that. But there are some wrinkles with this issue. The other thing is that verbs come in two forms, transitive and intransitive verbs. I'll talk about the difference between those two. And again, they're fairly basic, and all of us probably know intuitively what that difference is. But sometimes there are certain verbs that cause trouble, and it's because they're on this pivot point between transitive and intransitive. Think of the two forms that look similar, effect and affect, right? There is the difference between a transitive and an intransitive verb. And if you know that difference, you will always make the correct choice between those two verbs. And of course, another aspect of verbs that makes them quite complex is tense. And we have the basic tenses, past, present, and future. But also in English, we have the perfect tenses, right? Present tense, present perfect, past perfect, future perfect. And they can complicate things a little bit. Then there's the difference between active and passive, especially when it comes to research papers. It seems that there are preferences around these two kinds of verb. And finally, there is the different kinds of verbs that fall into this thing called mood. There are three moods in the English language. One is indicative mood verbs, which are the usual verbs, you know, like he went to the store. That's an indicative verb. But then there are conditional verbs, verbs that suggest that, well, it might be true if. So if you say, well, he might go to the store if he needs groceries, you know, that kind of thing. So that's a conditional verb, sometimes called the subjunctive in other languages. And then there's the imperative mood, which is simply the command form of the verb. Walk to the store with me, right? So again, these are fairly basic ideas, but when it comes to writing formally, and especially in the context of science, there are some wrinkles to attend to. Okay, so with respect to the difference between real verbs and impostors, we have a number of verb forms in English that are not, strictly speaking, verbs. So we call them verbals. These are things like participles. You know, like the word, the standardized tasting procedure included several steps. Notice that the word tasting looks like a verb, right? And you would say, in fact, he is tasting the tadpole. But in this sentence, that's not the case, right? The word tasting is really a modifier. It's like an adjective. It's modifying what word? The word procedure, right? What kind of procedure is it? It's a tasting procedure. So do you see how this word tasting, even though it looks like a verb, is not really acting that way? Another form of a verb that's not really a verb is called a gerund. And this is a verb that's used as a noun. So for instance here, the tasters placed the tadpole into their mouths and held it for 10 to 20 seconds. Well, that must be a long time. without biting into it. So notice that the word biting looks like a verb form, but it's really functioning here as a noun. Without what? Without what thing? Without biting. And then finally, you have another form of the verb that looks like a verb, but is not really, and that's the infinitive. Participants were directed to rinse their mouths out at least twice with fresh water before proceeding to the next tadpole, cleansing their palate. So the word to taste is the infinitive form, and it's functioning here as a noun. So with respect to that first sentence that you analyzed, where is the verb in that sentence? How many chose the word fleeing? Is that a verb? I mean, it looks like a verb, right? Is it? No. How about the word to evolve? No, that's an infinitive, isn't it? So where is the real verb in this sentence? Have had, right? It's actually two words. So in English, very often you'll have to use more than one word to express the verb. In this case, have had is the, okay. So, and that's of course at a very basic level. I hope that there's nothing new here. Have had. The other thing that complicates verbs at a very basic level is the idea of agreement, right? And when we say agreement, we mean that a verb form should agree with its subject in person and number. Usually number is the big one, right? So if you have a plural subject, then the verb should be a plural form. Fortunately, there's not too many different forms in English that are different between singular and plural, but there are enough to make us worried about using the correct form. And so, for instance, a basic singular form here, a tadpole was rinsed as opposed to were rinsed, right? Plurals, the tasters were asked as opposed to was asked. The opinion of the tasters were recorded or was recorded. So here's a case where we can get into a little trouble if we're not careful. What's the right choice here? Was, why? It's the opinion, right? So, but notice how taster is so close to the verb, you might be tempted to say, the opinion of the tasters were recorded. And no one will notice, right? But when it's written, it's more obvious. So here is a case where agreement is such a basic issue, but you have to be careful. Okay, so another place where you have to be a little careful is where you have a compound subject. That is to say, a subject with more than one word, right? So in this case, the subject of the verb were is two things, right? The participants and the investigator. So what do you do here when there are two words that are in the subject and one's singular and one's plural? What do you do? How do you view this subject? Is it a singular subject or a plural subject? It's plural, yeah, because you have more than one, right? You got participants and you got somebody else, so it's definitely plural. So that's pretty clear. But what about this? Neither the participants nor the investigator was in the room. Is that right? Was in the room? What do you think? So here's a wrinkle, right? We all know what subject-verb agreement is, and it's pretty clear, even in this sentence, what the correct answer is. But when you go into this kind of construction where it's neither nor, what do you do? Well, with neither nor, what they call the correlatives, what do? You choose the word that's closest to the verb. So it's correct to say neither the participants nor the investigator was, okay? That's because it's strictly not a plural subject, but like this one, because you're looking at them individually, so you use the one that's closest. On the other hand, if it were switched around, neither the investigator nor the participants were, this is also correct. right? Because the verb now is closest to this word, this part of the subject. So, what did you do with number 2? Are you joining us?
Yes.
Oh, good.
Thank you.
In conclusion, the data presented here for tadpoles, although slight, supports the general rule that one of the most palatable organisms are the least vulnerable to predator attack. That was the conclusion of this study, by the way, that if a organism wasn't very palatable, then it wouldn't get eaten by a predator. It makes sense, doesn't it? All right, so looking at the verbs in this sentence, are they matched up correctly? How did you match them up correctly with their
With this?
say again?
Not with this, the one with this. I usually get wrong with this, like when I wrote,
Yeah.
when I writing, yeah.
So it's correct here to say support, because what's the subject of support? What is doing the supporting in the sentence? The what?
Data.
Data, right. And of course we know as researchers that data is plural, right? Although we see so many cases where people, especially in the popular culture, will use it as a singular, just like media as another word that really should be plural. But in the context of science, it's always regarded as plural. So data presented here, support. And then moving on, is are. Well, what is it that is in this sentence? One, right. Not palatable organisms. Notice again how it would be very tempting to say organisms are, right? But the real sentence, the real subject of this clause, rather, is the word one. Okay? So I think this is a good sentence to show how, even though verbs are very basic, when it comes to a complex thought like this, where you're using language very precisely, you have to be careful. Okay. Transitive versus intransitive. This is the difference between verbs that take a direct object and verbs that don't. Here's an example of an intransitive verb. The palatability of the tadpoles falls as the temperature of the water rises. So both of those verbs, falls and rises, are considered intransitive verbs because they're not acting on anything. They're not taking a direct object. You can't fall something, right? And you can't rise something. That you just can't use the verbs that way. So that's why we call them intransitive. Pretty basic. Likewise, we might say the palatability of the tadpoles falls as we raise the temperature of the water. Notice how the word raise does take a direct object. It does act on something else. What are we raising? We're raising the temperature. So in this case, we call this a transitive verb. Again, this is fairly basic. But what about some other verbs, like this one? What did you choose between lie and lay? Lie. And why is that? You can't lie something, right? You can tell a lie, that's something else, but you can't lie. You can lay something on the table, but lie doesn't work that way, and that's why it's appropriate here, because they're not lying something, it's the tadpoles themselves that are lying, or they lie. So this is a intransitive verb, and it's the correct choice here. Now, when we're talking, we don't watch these things that carefully, and we will say, yeah, the tadpoles would lay rather still. Nobody's going to say anything, except a crusty old English teacher. But when you're writing, you want to be more careful. Okay. Verb tense. Another thing that would say, well, this is pretty basic, tense, past, present, future. So we have, for instance, present tense verbs. The tasters placed the tadpoles into their mouths. Past tense, the tasters placed. Future, the tasters will place. And then there's the perfect tenses. The tasters have placed, had placed, and will have placed. Now, it might be helpful to say here, well, why do we need these perfect tenses? Because they correlate with past, present, and future, the simple tenses, don't they? So why do we need another set of tenses? What's the idea of perfect? What does that mean? What does perfect mean? It's not really a value judgment, is it? It's completed action, very good. It's completed action. So if you want to make a distinction between this, the tasters placed, and the fact that they had done it and then it's over with, then you would use the past perfect instead of the simple past. Okay, so there is a simple distinction that might come into play when you're writing research. So, what did you do with this sentence, which asks you to choose with respect to tense? Demonstrate or demonstrated? Prefer or preferred? Demonstrated, yes. Why?
It's in the past.
Yes. I mean, this is clearly in the past, right? It's like ancient history. So they did this way back in '66, so we would say demonstrated. Now, you probably have read research reviews where the review of literature will say things like, well, Smith and Jones find that, and and they use the present tense. That's kind of odd, isn't it? Well, why are they doing that? Why are they describing the research that clearly happened in the past as though it were in the present, or why are they using present tense verbs? I mean, you may see this. Voris and Bacon clearly demonstrate that the bluegill fish, etc. I mean, that's okay, but only if it's in a research review section. But why is that done? Why is the timing is really violated? Say again?
Presenting a fact.
Well, yes, it's presenting the state of knowledge right now. Right now we know, because Voris and Bacon tells us that, all right? So we're trying to create a sense of research, the state of research right now, and now is in the present. So the convention is often to use the present tense, even though it clearly happened in the past. So there's a wrinkle there. What about this verb? Did you say prefer or preferred? Prefer, the present, is that what you, yes. And why is that? Again, these fish are probably dead by now, right? Why is it that we're saying, or the tadpoles, why is it that the action is cast in the present tense?
Because it's a fact, it's a species, right? We didn't say a particular tadpole named Toady preferred.
That's right. So what we're doing here is describing the characteristics of a species. That's just sort of general understanding right now, and so it is correct to say prefer. Yeah. Good. Okay. Where are we now? Verb voice. Okay, good. Verb voice. Verb voice, you have two choices, active and passive. In some languages, you have a middle voice, which really complicates things, but we won't have to do that. So active and passive voice simply means this, that in the active verbs, the subject is doing something to something else. On the other hand, passive verbs, you have a situation where the subject is getting acted on by something else. So here, we directed the participants, it is active, the participants were directed, Right, that's pretty clear, isn't it? So it's not a question of correctness that we have to struggle with. The question becomes, what's appropriate? Now, what did you say here? The apparent palatability to some tasters of these tadpoles suggests that the unsavory dermal compounds of this genus are not produced until metamorphosis. Is that okay? What's the question here? 5. Oh, okay, so we're simply identifying. So are there any active verbs in this sentence? Suggests, good, yeah. So notice that it's got an object. Suggests what? Well, suggests this whole clause, that the unsavory dermal compounds, etc. How about passive verbs? Do we have any passive verbs? Are produced, yes, or are not produced. Right. So the question now is, this is not so much correctness, but is it appropriate to use the active voice where it says suggests, and is it appropriate to use the passive where it says are not produced? It would seem kind of odd to make them any other way, wouldn't it? I mean, it would read strangely. So there's no problem here with respect to stylistic choices. Okay. The next thing I'd like to mention is that verbs have mood, which means you have a choice of 3 moods. Indicative mood verbs like this. The tasters bit firmly and fully into the body of the tadpole. Bit here is simply an indicative verb that suggests real action somewhere in time. But you could also use a verb to state a command, as in bite firmly and fully into the body of the tadpole. You're not likely to use this in a research paper, right? You wouldn't usually address the reader in a command form like this. But you might do it in an operating procedure. So if part of your work was to direct your participants to do a certain procedure, then you would use the imperative verbs. More than likely, you'll use, though, the conditional verbs in research papers. The tasters would not experience the full flavor if they did not bite firmly and fully into the body of the tadpole. So the word would experience is a verb form that we call conditional. And notice how it kind of implies that there might be a truthful statement here if there were certain conditions in mind. Okay. So on the pretest, you were asked to underline the correct form of a verb. So it is important in this experiment that the taster bite or bites firmly and fully into the tadpole. Bites. Normally you would say the taster bites firmly into the, right? But that's not really what the meaning of the sentence is it? You're not stating a fact that a taster bites into the tadpole. There's something else going on in this sentence, right? You're not indicating facts. That would be an indicative verb. In fact, it's correct to say bite in this sentence because of the introductory verb, it is important. When you have an expression like this to say, I recommend that, or it is important that, then the verb that follows needs to be conditional, or more directly in other languages, subjunctive. So here is one of those old forms that has lingered, and maybe for good reasons. Here's a distinction between indicative and conditional that only professional writers like you and me observe. And it makes a difference, doesn't it? So here is, I think, a rather formal difference in mood that you would want to try to observe. Okay. So in number 7, check the preferred version of sentence. Okay. So what would be the preferred version here? The following experiment was undertaken to compare the palatability of tadpoles with diverse ecology. We undertook the following experiment to compare the palatability. So what is the difference here in terms of the verb forms? It's the difference between passive and active, isn't it? So what do you think is the proper one to? The first one? The following was, that's certainly common, isn't it, to say it that way. And there are certain style guides that would say it's better to use the passive form, especially in the methods section, right? On the other hand, we do see a lot of style guides that say, nah, we prefer the active, even in the methods section. So it's okay to say, we undertook the following experiment, etc. Now, how are you going to know? It's like walking into a cocktail party and you want to make sure you're saying the right thing. And how do you know what the style, what the conventions are? Well, here's one, the APA style. How many people here are in the social sciences, health sciences? Okay, so I think many of the health sciences go to the APA style guide, is that correct?
It's more German than APA style, it's German style.
Oh yeah? Okay. So this is more general, American Psychological Association. But a lot of style guides that are more specific will draw on the APA style guide. And what does the APA style guide say? Preferred. We conducted the survey. None preferred. The survey was conducted. So there's an example of where the active form of the verb was preferred. I think that it's true to say that it's the editors and the journals that go back more in history, are more conventional, are more set in their ways, that are going to retain passive verbs. But I think a more vibrant, a more evolved scientific community has come to accept and prefer active verbs. And here's another example of a particular journal that states their preference. First person active voice is preferable to the impersonal passive voice. Here's another from the Journal of Advanced Nursing. Their style guide says, do not be afraid to use first person. We hypothesized is better than it was hypothesized. And of course, by now, I'm sure you've read a lot of literature that is written this way, isn't it? And yet, we'll see style guides that say, no, let's come into the 21st century. Let's do more of a personal voice in our writing. Here is a good incentive for adhering to a style guide. Use the active voice whenever possible. We will ask authors to rely heavily on the use of passive voice to rewrite the manuscripts in the active voice. So here is a good reason to check over your writing and say, I'm told I should use active voice. Let me check them out. So there are some wrinkles to this preference for active voice. And they come to us from a book by Joseph Williams. I gave you a couple of books on the back side of this handout that if you wanted to develop as a writer, if you have time to do that, these I think are the best books you could read in order to develop as a writer. I read them myself quite often. And Joseph Williams, who's dead now, but he was the editor of the Chicago Manual of Style, another Bible for formal writing. And he wrote a rather involved an involved chapter in this book about the differences between active and passive. And he gave some good examples of where passive voice is still a good idea. So here are some sentences to illustrate that. We have investigated the potential role. Specifically, we have studied the effects of. These are active verbs. And they're okay here, aren't they? Even in a method section, they're probably preferred by many style guides. To determine if monokenes elicited an adrenal steroidogenic response, I added a monocyte conditioned medium. So here's a sentence written by the researcher that's in the active voice, right? And it looks like it came right out of the methods section. But it's a little odd, isn't it, to suddenly see the researcher call attention to herself with the personal pronoun. Maybe we wouldn't have been so obvious, but when you get this personal, there's something odd about it. So William says, let's not go too far with this idea of moving into the active voice. And so it's okay to say this instead. Which, of course, is a passive verb, right? So that's about all I know about verbs. Any questions that you'd like to ask? Yeah.
So the difference between active and passive, to me, it looks like when you want to show off something, I would use more of an active. And passive, I mean, to me, it sounds like if I want to say something was done by somebody else, I would use passive rather than active. So
Yes.
Is that a right style?
Yeah, I think you're making a good point here. Let's go back to this. One of the things about passive verbs is it allows you to create a sentence without identifying who did it. And sometimes that's done a little dishonestly, you know, when they say about politicians, you know, mistakes were made. You know, well, who made them? So by creating that passive sentence, you don't have to refer to the responsible agent. But at a more neutral context, yes, I think when you want to say that something happened without calling attention to the agent, passive verbs, I think, are appropriate. Yeah. Any other questions? Do we have time to do a little exercise? How's our time?
We have about 10 minutes left.
10 minutes? Okay, good. So in the time that remains, what I'd like you to do is pair up, or maybe join 2 or 3 other people, and look at this. These are actually excerpts from a research paper written by a team, one of which is a Drexel professor. And observe the verbs in these excerpts. And notice, by the way, I've taken excerpts from all 4 sections of the research paper: introduction, methods, results, and discussion. Why did I do that? Well, verbs tend to shift around a little bit as you move from one section to the next. And that's an observation I'd like you to make. Take a look at the verbs in these various sections. Notice whether or not they're shifting in any way. Okay? So, join up with somebody else, a couple other people, see what you come up with.